The sharp crack of a gavel cut through the air like a thunderclap, commanding silence in Courtroom 9 of the Jefferson County Courthouse. Sergeant Major Daniel Rigg, you will stand for this court, Judge Evelyn Hart declared, her tone leaving no room for protest. What followed wasn't just a courtroom moment, it was the spark that ignited national attention and exposed how justice can falter when humanity is forgotten. Daniel Rigg, a 38-year-old Iraq War veteran, sat in his military-issue wheelchair, his right leg amputated below the knee and his left arm trembling intermittently from nerve damage sustained in a roadside explosion. He had served 3 tours, rescued comrades under fire, and now back home faced a courtroom indifferent to his sacrifice. Judge Hart, known for her no-nonsense approach and rigid adherence to protocol, barely glanced up from her bench as she repeated her demand. She dismissed Daniel's request for accommodation, stating that military service did not place anyone above the law. The courtroom, once bustling with quiet anticipation, grew uncomfortably still. Even those unfamiliar with Daniel's record could sense the injustice unfolding. His appointed attorney, visibly unsettled, attempted to intervene, but Daniel, calm and respectful, insisted on speaking for himself. Your Honor, he began, I would stand if I could, but my prosthetic and nerve damage make it nearly impossible today. The judge remained unmoved, brushing aside his explanation with bureaucratic coldness. Then came the moment that gripped everyone's attention. Daniel, trembling with effort, attempted to rise. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the defense table, his face etched with pain. After a few agonizing seconds, his body gave way and he collapsed hard onto the courtroom floor. A collective gasp rippled through the spectators. It was more than a fall, it was the physical collapse of dignity under the weight of misunderstanding. And as the judge looked down from her bench, the question hung heavy in the air. Had justice just demanded too much from a man who had already given everything? The silence that followed Daniel Rigg's collapse was deafening. For a few stunned seconds, no one moved. The only sound was the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Then the sharp scrape of a chair echoed through the chamber as Daniel's young attorney, Marcus Green, rushed to his side. Sergeant Rigg, don't move, Marcus whispered, his voice shaking. But Daniel, face twisted in pain and humiliation, was already struggling to rise. If she wants me to stand, he gritted out, then I'll stand. No, sir, came a voice from the back of the room. The speaker was an elderly man in a dark blazer, his white hair barely visible under a cap embroidered with the words Korean War veteran. He stepped forward, his voice trembling but resolute. He doesn't need to stand. I'll stand for him. Slowly he rose from his seat. A second later, a woman in a postal service uniform rose too. My son served with men like him, she said softly. He stood enough. Then one by one others stood. A teenager with a ROTC badge on his jacket, a middle-aged man in a construction vest, a mother holding a child. Within moments, nearly every person in the courtroom, dozens of strangers, were on their feet. It was a quiet, collective act of defiance, not against the law, but against the cold application of it that ignored humanity. They stood not just for Daniel, but for every wounded soul the system had overlooked. Judge Evelyn Hart watched from the bench, her expression unreadable. She cleared her throat, her voice breaking slightly as she attempted to reassert control. This court will have order, but the words lacked the force they once carried. Her authority, still intact on paper, was being quietly questioned by the people it was meant to serve. From the floor, Daniel looked around, eyes wide in disbelief. Pain lingered on his face, but something else began to shine through, something deeper. Gratitude, hope. Even Marcus, still crouched beside him, felt the tide turn. You're not alone, sir, he whispered. With Marcus's help, Daniel slowly hoisted himself back into his wheelchair. His muscles shook with the effort, but he kept his head high. Once seated again, he turned to the judge. Your Honor, he said, his voice stronger than it appears. I'm standing now through them. A hush fell across the courtroom. Judge Hart, visibly shaken, adjusted her robe and stared down at her desk. She opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. For the first time in her long tenure, she looked unsure of what to say. The power dynamic in that room had shifted, not through rebellion or disrespect, but through silent, united empathy. As the bailiff stepped forward to maintain protocol, the courtroom doors creaked open. A tall woman in an army dress uniform stepped in, bearing the insignia of a high-ranking officer. She introduced herself as Colonel Natalie Reyes from the Department of Veterans Affairs. I've been sent to observe these proceedings, she said, approaching the bench. And what I've observed already troubles me deeply. Judge Hart's lips parted in protest, but no words came. Her courtroom. Her rules suddenly felt smaller. This wasn't just a hearing anymore. It had become a reckoning. Judge Evelyn Hart sat silently behind the large oak desk in her chambers, her fingers trembling slightly as she turned over the official letter Colonel Natalie Reyes had placed before her. The seal of the Department of Veterans Affairs stared back at her, unwavering and absolute. Across from her, Colonel Reyes stood with calm authority, arms folded, eyes locked onto the woman who had just moments earlier ruled her courtroom with iron precision. This is judicial interference, Judge Hart snapped, her voice sharp but laced with something unfamiliar. Uncertainty, you don't get to waltz into my courtroom and undermine my authority. With respect, Your Honor, Reyes replied smoothly. I didn't undermine your authority. Your actions did that on their own. There was a heavy pause. The weight of what had just transpired in the courtroom still hung between them. Judge Hart looked away for a moment, her eyes landing on a photo of her father on the wall, Major General Thomas Hart Stern, in his full-dress uniform. She had spent her life honoring his legacy, rising through the ranks of the judiciary by refusing to bend to emotion, always favoring order and discipline over empathy. But now in the quiet of her chambers, that foundation had begun to crack. I grew up on military bases, the judge said, finally, her voice lower, quieter. My father served in Korea, then Vietnam. He believed in strength, in rules. Weakness wasn't tolerated, not in our house, not ever. Reyes didn't interrupt. She could see the internal battle playing out behind the judge's stern expression. When I saw Sergeant Rigg refuse to stand, something in me, Hart trailed off, searching for the right words. It wasn't just about courtroom decorum. It was like he was rejecting the very discipline I'd built my life on. Colonel Reyes softened her stance. He wasn't rejecting discipline, Judge. He was doing the bravest thing a soldier can do, showing vulnerability. That's not weakness. That's the price of service. And what happened out there in your courtroom was not just a legal failure. It was a moral one. The judge sat back, visibly shaken by the honesty. He fell in front of everyone. That moment, him struggling to stand, then collapsing, it will stay with me forever. And what followed, Reyes said, will stay with the nation. A room full of people standing for one man who could not stand himself. That moment spoke louder than any verdict or ruling ever could. Judge Hart looked down at her hands still resting on the VA documents. What would you have me do? Reyes took a deep breath. Acknowledge what happened. Make it right. Not just for Sergeant Rigg, but for every disabled veteran who walks into a courthouse and feels unseen, unheard, or dismissed. The judge nodded slowly. There are changes I can make, immediate ones. Procedural reviews, accommodation reforms, training for clerks and bailiffs. I can also dismiss the contempt charge. That's a start, Reyes said, her tone gentle but firm. But there's more. You need to stand up for him publicly. Your voice carries weight. People will listen. Judge Hart was quiet for a long moment before rising from her chair. Then let's make it right. The courtroom was packed again as the session reconvened. Daniel Rigg sat in his wheelchair near the front, flanked by Marcus Green and several members of the public who had stood for him earlier. He looked tired but alert, resolute. Judge Hart entered the room with none of her usual briskness. Her gaze swept over the crowd, many of whom remained standing in silent anticipation before she approached the bench. She tapped her gavel once gently. You may be seated, she said. The gallery obeyed, though their eyes never left her. Sergeant Rigg, she began, her voice steadier than before. This court owes you not just an apology, but an admission. In my pursuit of courtroom discipline, I failed to recognize the greater discipline it takes to live every day with the sacrifices you've endured. A murmur passed through the room. Daniel's eyes widened slightly, then narrowed as he listened. I am dismissing the contempt charges against you, Judge Hart continued. Furthermore, I am issuing a standing administrative order to provide full ADA-compliant accommodations in all proceedings involving you, including remote appearances when necessary. She paused, gathering herself. And beyond that, I am initiating a full accessibility review of this courthouse, and I will be recommending similar actions statewide. Daniel nodded, appreciation in his eyes, but she wasn't finished. To those who stood for Sergeant Rigg today, you reminded this court what justice really looks like. It is not just a set of rules. It is respect, dignity, and above all, humanity. For the first time, she looked directly at Daniel. I failed you, but this won't happen again. Not here, not under my watch. A wave of applause broke out, quiet at first, then swelling as more people joined in. Daniel's hand instinctively reached for Marcus's arm. Is this real? He asked softly. Marcus just smiled. You changed the room, Sergeant, without ever standing up. The sun had barely risen over the city courthouse when Sergeant Daniel Rigg wheeled himself through the familiar front doors, not for another hearing, but for something far more profound. The rededication ceremony of Courtroom 4 had drawn a modest crowd, veteran city officials, court staff, and a handful of reporters who had followed Daniel's story since the moment he collapsed before the bench just weeks earlier. The room looked different now. Wider aisles, a lowered witness stand, a permanent ramp behind the defense table, and next to the judge's bench, deliberately placed an empty wheelchair. A quiet symbol of change, a marker that someone had been seen, not just heard. Judge Evelyn Hart stood at the podium, her usual formal posture softened by the weight of reflection. Gone was the sharp edge of courtroom command. Today she spoke not as a figure of authority, but as someone who had been changed by what she had witnessed and what she had almost failed to see. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, justice must never be blind to the humanity before it. She paused, letting the words hang in the air. 3 weeks ago, I ordered a man to stand, she said. A man who had stood for this country in ways most of us will never fully comprehend. When Sergeant Rigg fell in this courtroom, so too did my confidence that I was serving justice, as it should be, equally compassionately and wisely. Daniel sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap. He wasn't there for applause. He had heard all kinds of words before, medals pinned to his chest, doctors' explanations, VA denials. But these were different. These words came from someone who had once dismissed him and now stood in front of others to own that mistake. Judge Hart continued, I am deeply sorry for what happened here. Not just to Sergeant Rigg, but to every veteran, every disabled citizen who has felt invisible inside these walls. We can't rewrite what occurred, but we can rebuild what it meant. The room fell silent again, heavy with emotion. In the last 2 weeks, she added, I have met with accessibility consultants, veterans advocates, and leaders in judicial ethics. Effective immediately, all courthouses in this county will undergo accessibility audits, and each courtroom will have a compliance officer to ensure accommodations are not just promised, but practiced. There was a brief stir in the audience, soft applause, nods of affirmation. And that's not all, she continued. In partnership with the Department of Veterans Affairs and Colonel Natalie Reyes, I will be leading a new judicial education program titled Seeing the Unseen Disability, Dignity, and the Law. This program will be mandatory for all sitting judges in this district by the end of the year. Colonel Reyes, standing near the wall in full dress uniform, gave a subtle nod. Her presence was quiet but commanding, as it had been the day she walked into the courtroom and handed Judge Hart a reality she could no longer ignore. When the judge stepped away from the podium, the crowd began to rise. Not as a protest, not out of defiance, but as a gesture of unity. They stood for something now. They stood for someone, for Daniel, for what he represented. The moment was interrupted by a soft hum of microphones. Reporters stepped forward and one asked Sergeant Rigg, would you like to speak? Daniel turned to Marcus Green, who raised his eyebrows slightly, as if to ask, you ready? Daniel nodded, rolled forward to the podium, and looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, some not, but all watching him with a kind of reverence that felt both humbling and overwhelming. I'm not a public speaker, he began, his voice steady. I was a sergeant in the Marines. I taught my guys to speak less, act more. So that's what I tried to do here. Not make noise. Just stand when I could. He paused, the silence respectful. I never wanted to be at the center of anything he said. But what happened here reminded me, and reminded all of us, that sometimes one person's fall can lift up many others. He turned briefly toward Judge Hart. It takes strength to admit when you were wrong, and it takes even more strength to change because of it. Your apology matters, Judge. Your actions matter more. Then he looked back at the crowd. Change isn't loud. Sometimes it starts with a man falling. And other times it starts when the people around him decide he shouldn't have to get back up alone. There was nothing else to say. Nothing else needed to be said. As the ceremony came to a close, Judge Hart approached Daniel quietly. "Thank you for letting me fix what I broke." Daniel simply extended his hand. "Thank you for standing after I fell." That night, local news stations broadcast the ceremony, and by morning clips had spread across the country. For many, it wasn't just a courtroom story anymore. It was a call to action. Other judges began requesting access to the training. Veterans sent emails thanking Daniel for being their voice. The National Association of State Courts scheduled a conference to examine national disability reform in judicial spaces. And in courtrooms across America, quiet changes began, ramps installed, benches lowered, procedures reviewed. Because one man couldn't stand, and others decided to stand for him. What began as a single act of silent defiance inside a courthouse grew into a movement that would ripple across the nation. Sergeant Daniel Rigg never set out to be a symbol. He simply wanted to be heard, to be treated with fairness and dignity, values he had once risked his life to defend. Yet that moment when he collapsed trying to stand in Judge Evelyn Hart's courtroom struck a chord far beyond the wooden walls of Courtroom 4. In the days that followed the judge's public apology and the sweeping accessibility reforms in her district, Daniel was invited to testify before the U.S. Senate. His quiet strength and unwavering honesty moved senators, staffers, veterans, and civilians alike. When he told the chamber true justice doesn't require everyone to stand, it requires everyone to be seen. The room rose to its feet, this time not out of protest but out of solidarity. The image of a disabled veteran in his wheelchair before a standing Congress became iconic. News stations aired it, editorials praised it, and most importantly, communities acted on it. State by state, courtrooms were reviewed for accessibility, veteran centers received added funding, and schools began teaching lessons on empathy and inclusion. Sergeant Rigg later said, "I never stood alone. Even when I was on the ground, others stood for me." And that's what defines a country, not how high we stand, but how we lift one another up. In a world that often measures strength by noise and motion, true courage lies in quiet resilience. We don't always need to fight to be heard, but we must never be afraid to speak through our example. Daniel's story reminds us that dignity is not given, it is honored. And sometimes the greatest change begins when one person refuses to be invisible. If this story moved you, if you believe our veterans, our disabled citizens, and every person deserves equal dignity, leave a comment below with the words, "I stand for others." Subscribe to our channel for more powerful real-life stories that restore faith in justice, humanity, and compassion. Don't just scroll by, stand with us by clicking the bell and help spread the message that every voice matters, especially when spoken through silence and strength. Together we rise.